Hello, Mech Warriors, and welcome to the Mechbay, where we fix your mech and fix your game. All right, and I'm your host, Josh, and today we have our co-host, Dustin, back in the hot seat.
How's it going?
And we've brought back Kurt by special demand for covering the movement phase.
Thank you for having me again.
So first, let's do some hobby progress and news. So, Dustin, what have you gotten done lately?
I just started up some Tau stealth suits. Been working on my Riptide still. Still not painting Battletech stuff. Soon.
Shame on you. Shame. What about you, Kurt?
I'm not much better. Lately, for me, it's been a lot of 3D printing projects. Working on a big word bearer trader guard for my 30k forces. Working on an Imperial Baneblade for that. A couple biker units for my Dark Angels for 30k.
Okay. I mean, to be fair, I've only gotten one thing painted, and that was putting the finishing touches on my Chaos Lord for my Sigmar army, which I swear I'll get done this year.
Welcome to the Battletech Podcast, where we talk about painting 40k stuff.
To be fair, it's pretty cold here, and I have been very fearful of priming anything, even though I could prime inside in my own painting booth. Still a little fearful of, the lack of humidity and the paint all messing up my brand new, beautiful mechs. Gray is better than bad, foamy, gritty gray.
Yes.
So, not much for the hobby progress, but we do have some Battletech news. We had Ill Clan come out. Dustin, you actually finished reading it.
Yeah, what a tome. But I powered through it. We'll probably talk some spoilers at the end of the podcast, maybe.
Give me the skinny on the book without giving any spoilers.
Okay, yeah. Ill Clan, quite the tome written by Blaine Lee Pardoe. Lots of battles, kind of setting the scene for Ill Clan. As the name implies, there's some clans. They come to Terra. They're looking to kick some Delvenstone booty. And read the book, find out what happens.
One bit of news from the Kickstarter, though, is we do have new maps, the Circle of Equals. Kurt, why don't you talk about those?
As I said, I'm a big Clan Ghostbear player, so when I heard that they were coming out with a Circle of Equals, I knew I had to get a set. I was already getting one for my Kickstarter backing, but I ordered an extra.
Woo!
Yeah, that was a high priority add to the order. Gotta have the full circle so we can have our proper clan duels.
The maps are looking different than kind of what I had in my head. They look kind of like a city, don't they?
Yeah, they look like a rebel burned out city. But for my inquisitive brain, so you actually need two maps to make a full circle?
Correct. Yes, it's two identical maps that they designed to be interconnected. So it's a half circle per neoprene mat.
You said identical. Are they the same mat and you just mirror them?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have this 1997 MechWarrior 2 Circle of Equals map in my head, and it's just like a Thunderdome.
That's kind of the look I was getting out of it, because you can kind of see the lights on the outside, the boundaries, and very industrial. So there's a bunch of places that get some hiding spots or get some maneuver in there, while at the same time having some good clan sight lines. If that's what you're doing, if that's the type of mech you're running in the duel.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to having some of those maps. All right, so let's get to the meat of our segment today, and that's mastering the movement phase. So we're going to be talking about actually using your mechs to their full advantage, generating movement points, and using them to either evade your enemy or encircle them, surround them, and kill them. When it comes to movement, you really have four options. And that is, you can either walk, you can run, you can jump, or you can just stand still.
So when you move, you're going to be generating the A in the Gator. You read the Battle Mech Manual, they will recommend when you're setting up your to-hit numbers that you use Gator, and that's gunnery, attackers movement, targets movement, other, and range. So we're going to be talking about the A in the Gator a little bit as we discuss the different movement modes. They will make it more difficult for you to shoot at your target, but ideally it will make it even more difficult then for your target to shoot at you.
So we'll start with walking. Now, walking generates one attacker movement, so no matter how far you walk, you'll always be taking a +1 to you shooting the enemy. Its most common movement range for all mechs is about 3 hexes to 8 hexes. You also generate 1 heat when you move, and no matter what happens to your mech, you can always walk 1 hex.
Yeah, and that's the minimum movement rule. You'll find that in the Battle Mech Manual and or Total Warfare.
We also have running, and that's really just 1.5 times your walking speed rounded up, and that generates 2 attacker movement. So no matter how far you run, you'll always be taking a +2 to your shooting. Its most common movement range is 5 hexes to 12 hexes, and that will always generate 2 heat, but this also comes with a couple stipulations. You can't run in water, you should not run on pavement, or else you will have to take a pilot skill check, and you could fall and skid, and you can't run backwards.
As for running on pavement, to be a little pedantic, you have to move or, orient your mech in a different direction and then move into a new hex to generate that skid check. The skid check scales very similarly to your movement modifier on the table for how difficult it is to make the skid check.
We also have jumping for the mechs that do have jump jets on them. This generates 3 attacker movement. Its most common movement ranges are 3 to 6 hexes. The stipulations for jumping is you can't jump in water if your jump jets are actually below the surface of water, and you can't jump if you're laying down. The biggest stipulation of jumping is it generates 1 heat per hex moved with a minimum of 3. So if you jump to the hex next to you, you'll still take 3 heat. So you might as well jump as far as you can. And finally, we have standing still.
So standing still, you're not going to generate any movement modifiers for you. You're also not going to generate any attacker modifiers for the person that's shooting at you.
If you absolutely need to hit something and you don't care about return fire, this is the best choice. You won't generate any heat, but you won't be a harder target. You're just reducing all of the modifiers.
Might also be a good idea if you're sitting in heavy cover and whatever you would move would not generate as much defensive ability as your current cover.
Be a mech shaman in heavy woods.
So like we discussed last time, each of the different weight classes of mechs excels at a different kind of movement. Light mechs are going to go fast, so they're going to try to generate the best attacker modifier that they can to not get blown to bits. Mediums can kind of pick the best choice at the time. They're more jack of all trades. They're going to jump if they can to get to better cover, or they're going to run to cover more distance. Heavies, not as many of them have jump jets, but they do what they can. They're going to normally move to cover in the early stages. They're going to run, and then they're going to switch to walking when they actually are going to be taking shots. And the assaults, those guys move slow, and they just take that return fire, because normally running will only get them 1 extra hex, but won't get them any more modifiers. So when you move 1 to 2 hexes, you don't actually get a bonus to being shot back at. So normally you're not going to take that advantage. 3 to 4 is when you start to generate a mod of 1. 5 to 6 hexes is 2. 7 to 9 is 3. 10 to 17 is 4. 18 to 24 is +5. And if you move more than 25 hexes, it's +6 to hit you. But essentially all that means is the more hexes you move, the harder it is to get shot at. All right, so one of the biggest things that I had to deal with when I was learning the game was deciding on when to walk and when to run. There's a big offensive versus defensive strategy to movement. And like I said before, it is probably the most complex part of the game. And once you learn to do it properly fast, your game's going to completely change for the better. Do you prefer to run or walk most of the time?
Generally, for my lights and my mediums, I run far more. My heavies and assaults, I tend to walk far more, simply because, as we've said, a lot of the assaults, for example, are 3-5. So unless I'm running in a straight line or something, I'm really not anticipating much of a mod. So I'd rather just have a much better odd of hitting. Because I also my heavies are usually archers, marauders, warhammers, those type of heavies for me. It's the to hit mods for them is more important. My lights and my mediums go fast, jump or run, whichever gets me the best mod.
So for me, I guess the flow chart for in my head when I'm looking at the board, when I'm looking at my mechs and trying to decide whether or not I want to run, walk, or jump any given mech, the first part of the equation for me is, am I going to generate more of a modifier for being shot at than I'm going to generate for attacking? So ideally, in any given situation, I want to be making it harder to hit my mech than I'm making it for me to shoot at somebody else's mech. So if I can walk which generates +1 for me, and get a +2 or +3 for the enemy shooting at me, I'll try to walk. The same thing goes for running. I'm going to be generating +2 for running, and if I can generate a +3 or a +2 at least, I like to be even at the minimum, if not making it harder for my opponent to shoot at me. And that's step one. That's conditional. Is it more important to get into cover? I might push my mech to run or even jump. And that's generally how I look at the movement. One exception to the rule, almost always, if I have a big gun with jump jets attached to it, like a Victor on the field, I'm going to take that disadvantage to try to get my AC-20 or some other large gun into position for a good shot. I'll take +3 on my Victor. It's making +3 for me to shoot at a target, and I can only generate a +2 for the target shooting at me, and I'll do that almost every turn. And then the last part of that flow chart is general positioning of my mechs overall, which is the real chess part of Battletech. How do you look at the field and where your mechs are, and how do you look into the future? And I'm constantly trying to balance that whole flow chart, and it's not easy.
No, I mean, I agree. There's definitely the sweet spots to, like you said, walking and getting a +2, or running and getting a +3. That's probably like a Shadowhawk that can walk 5. It's actually going to generate +2 to the return fire, or running an 8, and it's going to get a +3. So that's something to always keep in mind.
Yeah, movement is definitely the most critical phase of the game, and I think the one that is like the master class. Your master experienced players are going to be utilizing it a lot better. That's your high level play.
Yeah, and when to prioritize positioning and firing. And by prioritize, I mean you're going to be getting more to your to hit than your enemy would. When to do that is, like Kurt was saying, a real masterclass. I don't even know that I've come close to mastering that.
So let's walk through the first couple turns of a hypothetical game. So when I deploy mechs on the field, I'm almost always going to be running my first turn, because the enemy is normally going to be either long range or completely out of range for most of my weapons. I'm just trying to get to the lines of fire that I want. I'm trying to take as much of the terrain and field so I can dictate the engagement and the ranges. So like if there's a mountain or hill that lets me overlook an open terrain, I'm always going to put a mech that may be more offensively geared, but I'm going to try to take that hill so I can take that larger percentage of the actual map that we're playing on. Dustin, you've played against me a couple times, and I feel like we always end up playing in your 25% of the map.
Yeah, I would also say that typically, generally speaking, you bring more brawlers to the field than I do. So you're running them down, you're getting them into range, and you're putting pressure on my, less brawler lists, and really dictating the part of the map that the engagement is taking place in.
Yeah, I'm definitely trying not to look at the terrain that's in my side of the map. I'm looking at the midboard and your deployment zone's terrain, because if you have good terrain in your deployment zone, I want you to be able to move out of that so I can take advantage of you being in open terrain. But if you don't have a defensive deployment zone, I'm definitely going to try to push my mechs deeper into the middle and keep you on your toes and make you fight somewhere that you didn't want to. Yep. And that's definitely going to be making sure that I'm using all of my movement as possible. I may be generating a bad to hit modifier, but in those first couple turns, I'm not worried about doing damage. I'm more worried about dictating where the actual engagements are going to happen.
And I find, conversely, when we're playing those matches, that typically I bring a sniper to the game, and I'm looking for a nest to put that sniper in, somewhere where I can keep it stationary but generate decent numbers, some sort of light or heavy cover with a good field of fire. And my brawler and my 2 skirmishers that I typically bring in a normal list are just running a screen and trying to react and try to keep that theater in view of the sniper. Yeah, so one thing to think about when you're moving, one thing I left out of my little flow chart is whether you have the initiative or not. And I mean, you can have the initiative even if you didn't win the initiative. You might be moving all your mechs and saving one particular mech because you want them to react to a situation. And seeing your opponent, what they've moved and what kind of modifier they've generated might also greatly influence whether you decide to walk, run, or jump your mech. If you can walk a mech and generate enough of a movement mod and a terrain modifier, say that combines to make it harder for your mech to be shot at than the mech you're shooting at after the opponent's mech has already moved, you might walk instead of run.
Yeah, I mean, if your opponent is trying to bug out a little bit and they're backing up and expose like a flank that's damaged, or they don't get out of the way of some of your long range guns, you're going to trade a lot of your defensive mods and positioning to take advantage of that and punish them.
Yep.
It's literally all about risk and reward and mitigating actually hitting your target versus hitting back. So if you see the opportunity to do a lot of damage, you have to weigh that with, okay, I'm going to dish out more damage, but I'm also going to take it. But at this key moment, that's where the game comes down.
Yeah, and to reference earlier what I was talking about with jumping a victor always, sometimes I roll the dice, so to speak, taking a shot that I'm going to make less frequently, just hoping that the dice favor me. But generally, overall, when I'm playing, I am attempting to game the numbers. I'm trying to position my mechs and use my movement to generate more favorable odds for my mechs more frequently than my opponents. Because as far as I'm thinking, if I can be shooting on lower numbers and being shot at on higher numbers more frequently throughout the engagement, I'm just going to have a better chance to keep my mechs alive and disable my opponent's mechs.
So you bring up initiative. So what goes through your thought process, and how do you pick the first/last mech?
So part of it definitely depends on positioning. I will typically, generally speaking, move my heavier mechs first, kind of use them to sink the initiative. If I've got an assault mech, that's not going to go very far in the first place. I'm just going to position them for flexibility. I want them to be able to cover or be able to shoot at where I expect the enemy mechs to be moving, and I will save my lighter and faster assets to react to the opponent's moves.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
Third, yeah, it's definitely especially critical for those backstabber mechs. Things like your Jinners, your Javelins.
Another thing to keep in mind for movement is, what your opponent's mechs can do, and being aware of how far, just like basic stuff, how far they can move, whether or not they're going to be able to get into your rear firing arc, and reacting to that. Kind of keeping that in mind as far as your game theory is concerned. And then...
You mean like don't overextend yourself, essentially, right?
Yeah, don't overextend yourself, or make sure that if you're overextending yourself, that it's really worth it.
I mean, technically you can overextend something that you want to use as bait and almost draw them in. If they think you're presenting a nice tasty mech that they can shoot, they could get closer, they could expose their flanks. They might move to generate less of a mod for their shooting to take advantage of it, which will let you shoot them better.
Yeah, so sometimes you'll move your lighter asset into the rear arc of another mech, maybe even, right up on top of them so you can give them an old kick in the back. And then your opponent moves their mech into that mech, your mech's rear arc, and then you end up with the conga line. You've got 4 mechs lined up back to back or front to back, which can lead to some interesting dice rolls and results, outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, by that point, you're really just, can I roll better than my opponent?
Yeah, and that's one of the cores of, one of the core concepts of the movement phase. Can I roll better than my opponent? And a really interesting part of the movement phase is that it's just prep for the firing phase, because, the shooting phase is when you get your damage in.
But if you don't move to a range that you can actually do damage in, then your shooting phase is pointless by then. So you really have to execute your movement exactly how you want to actually do damage in the rest of the phases.
Yeah, and another thing I'm looking at when I'm moving my mechs is, of course, how high are my modifiers going to be? I really like to keep things at 8 or less. So if I'm shooting for 9s, 10s, 11s, or 12s, I just assume that I'm going to miss those shots, and I feel like my games are happier then. It's never good to assume that you're going to make shots on 7s or 8s, but if I can keep things if I'm moving, if I can keep my attack modifiers kind of at or below 8, that makes me happy, which is typically a walk or a run and medium range for my weapons.
Yeah, generally it depends which force I'm playing of the day, but generally it's a mix of those two. I do like my fire support max, but then on the other hand, I do like my dragonflies. I like my javelins. I like my nice backstabby light and medium mechs as a Davian player.
So you more like to run circles around the enemy and keep them guessing where you're coming from.
Yeah, if I need to pull back, I can pull back. If I can get a better shot in medium range, even if I have to run, I'm going to do it as a medium or a light.
Yeah, I know when I play against you, I never can see where the
point of engagement's going to be.
Exactly. You're constantly trying to find my flanks and generate huge mods around them. You actually like to play on the sides of the map more than I do.
Yeah, I definitely like to try to encircle.
So that's pretty much mostly... So how necessary do you think moving into terrain is and cover versus just moving for a better shot? When will you take the cover bonuses versus the attacker movement modifiers?
For me, it's kind of what's the next turn hold. If it's a light or a medium, especially if I lack jump jets, I'm going to be a little bit more wary about going through cover, simply because it's going to slow me down the next turn.
I'm pretty leery of getting a lighter asset tied up in terrain. I want to make sure that an ideal position for a light or medium mech for me is one where I can react in the next turn. If somebody moves a heavier or closer range mech into my light or medium mech, I want to be able to both run away from the target or, if need be, engage that target. So I like to keep my faster mechs more flexible. So I might keep them out of terrain more frequently than I would keep heavier assault mechs. I might put them in woods or move them through woods more frequently than I would my lighter assets or my more maneuverable assets.
Yeah, agreed. My heavies and my assaults tend towards being more fire support. So I definitely have more of a sniper role for them.
For me, when I'm moving, I try not to look at the terrain for like something that I should move into as much, because a lot of the terrain is almost placed, in my opinion, as like a trap. Like normally you've got a hill on one side that you can't see through, or more woods in front of it that are actually line of sight blocking. And if I commit to, well, I'm moving here because I will get a good terrain modifier, then I'm not actually playing against my opponent. I'm playing against the map. And that's a bad mindset to get myself into. Because once I commit to, well, I work to get this woods to get the cover modifier, well, now I'm going to try not to leave it because it's mine. I worked for it. And that's just setting myself up to get destroyed and encircled.
Yeah, one of the things I think that might be tempting for a newer player is what I call like turret tech. You don't want to get all of your mechs buried inside of heavy or light woods on the edge of a nice field because you think to yourself, oh, I'm going to get +1 or +2 to hit me without generating any mods because I'm going to stand my mechs still inside of these woods. But at that point, you've given up all the maneuverability to your opponent, and they can choose how to engage your mechs that are dug out in forests. And I think by that you give yourself less flexibility. So picking and choosing when to use terrain to your advantage is important.
Kurt, what about you?
Very much agreed, because as we said, I'm always kind of looking on how can I hit the sides, how can I get around to hit one flank or the other. So yeah, staying fluid, even if you got the better to hit, if my opponent has better to hit mods, I still see myself as being ahead if I'm more fluid.
Yeah, you never know how the initiative roll is going to go. You never know what your opponent's going to do, so staying flexible is pretty important, in my opinion, when it comes to movement. And it's something I fight myself with. I'm real tempted to get, like I mentioned earlier, to put that sniper in a what I would consider or think to myself is a great spot. But, my enemy, my opponent, is just as capable of hiding from me if I spend all these movement points getting my sniper into a nest.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing about once you commit to staying in cover is you've given up the ability to dictate range. You're just hoping that the opponent will be afraid to come any closer, and that's never going to work because there's almost always something that's more mobile. Like I said, there are mechs that can either run or jump 5, 6, 7 hexes, and that's normally the range that a mech is going to want to, I'm going to stand in this light woods and peck across this open terrain. Well, what's going to happen is you're going to lose the initiative, and they're going to just jump a mech behind you and try to open up rear armor. And then once you're trying to fight that, maybe the next turn, the rest of their brawler mechs or assault mechs are just going to cross that open terrain. When you're looking behind you, just completely dictate the engagement.
Yeah, and another thing I'd say as a general concept to keep in mind in movement is just like chess, be looking at 2 turns into the future. You can only spend so much time thinking about how you're going to move your mechs, but running your mech to a certain spot to generate a mod might be cool, but having your mech in a position to move next turn might be more important than that extra +1 to hit.
So one of the big things that I struggle with is deciding when to jump versus when to run when I'm not trying to just move across terrain. What are some things that y'all think about when you are jumping your mech?
When it comes to my mechs that have jump jets, one of the things I like to do is put them in places that make them unpredictable. I think one of the greatest assets a mech with jump has is its ability to be anywhere, with some exceptions, within its jumping range. So there's a bubble around your mech with, say you've got a Shadowhawk that can jump 5 hexes, you're taking control of every hex within 5 of that Shadowhawk, and your opponent has to assume that it could be anywhere in there. So using my jumping mechs, my jump capable mechs, to put pressure on my opponent and kind of deny a part of the map, make it risky to move into that part of the map for my opponent. Yeah, so outside of jumping over terrain, just to get to a position faster, which is always a great ability of a mech with jump, positioning them in such a way to take advantage of their unpredictability.
Kurt, what about you? You're our resident mojo man when it comes to jumping mechs.
Just from my clan Ghost Bear, which we can also apply the same thing to the spider, for example. The Dragonfly, for me, generates, it's an 8-12-8. So if I jump, it's always going to be generating more of a mod for my opponent than for me. So in that case, I'm always going to jump. Same thing for the spider in 30-25 play. There's a couple others out there that can match it. But if it's anything 7+ jump, I always do it. And most of the time, like my other jumping lights, like my javelin, it's more a matter of, can I get away with a walk to get behind my opponent? Or do I need to jump to get there?
Yeah, my big use of jumping is just to either push on the enemy once I've dictated the engagement, or to get across terrain that would cost me more movement points than to walk or run. Like I won't want to go around those heavy woods if I'm trying to move up the field. I'm just going to choose to jump over it and essentially not count that turn for shooting. I'm going to designate, all right, this is a turn where I need to establish movement dominance, essentially. Push up 3 or 4 hexes on the map. So I'm going to jump 1 or 2 or even 3 of my mechs if they're capable, and just own a little bit more of the field.
I feel like another important thing to mention when it comes to mechs that can jump is all mechs that can jump have the ability to death from above, which is a great reason to literally never death from above. I have never seen it work out. It has never worked out for me, and I have heard from players who have 20 years of experience that death from above is just not a great idea. If you start a death from above, you're going to encourage your opponent to generate a PSR, a pilot skill roll for your mech by dishing out more than 20 damage to it, and you're going to fall, and you're not going to roll high enough, even with a high pilot skill, or rather a low pilot skill, an advantageous pilot skill, to actually connect with that death from above. It's going to be bad.
It's very much reserved for a few Hail Marys. There was one situation I have seen it work for us. Or was it a push? The Mega Mech game where we pushed the heavy mech off the cliff.
Yeah, I have attempted. The only times I attempt to death from above anymore is when a successful death from above would push an enemy mech off the map, and I've still never been successful.
On the other side of the coin from death from above, so you do have charging and pushing, which is something that you need to declare in the movement phase.
I've attempted a couple charges. Those are pretty risky. You can't shoot when you charge. I would say when it comes to movement, I would never, unless I brought a charger to the field and I really just wanted to try the dice gods, I would never construct my turn around a push or a charge or a death from above.
See, that's a little different from me. So because I like to move up to essentially the mid, almost to the enemy's deployment zone, that's something that's always in my mind is when is there a chance? Like if they put their backs against the edge of the map, that's like begging for me to run up, give up a shooting to completely destroy mech, because if I push them off the map, they're out of play. That's it. So I would always trade 20 medium lasers versus just one dice roll to kill a mech. And I'm pretty sure I've done that to one of your mechs, Kurt.
Trying to remember the situation.
Pretty sure it was a champion charging a dasher.
Whoa.
Game of graphic memory.
Game of graphic memory.
I have the pictures if you don't believe me, but I did push the mech. Technically, I charged the mech and displaced him off the map.
Nice.
So that movement phase does have the ability to destroy mechs, and that's just something that you have to keep in mind.
Yeah, him pushing or charging a mech off of a cliff and having them take a bunch of fall damage.
Yeah, that was what I think I was remembering from one of our campaigns we were running in Mega Mech since COVID.
Yeah, we pushed the dragon off the hill, and it fell like 3 things and completely blew up.
Yeah, and I think at the time we were in light mechs, or maybe like a 40-tonner.
Oh, we were all light mechs.
we were definitely outgunned and out-armored compared to that.
I'm trying to think if there's anything else when it comes to movement. It's everything, and it's also so hard to talk about.
I mean, the hard part about talking about movement is it's very reactive, but it's very proactive. So you can't think of it in a vacuum. You have to think about what your opponent has, and you're either working against it or working against what they're doing.
Yeah, and with Battletech, much like chess, board positioning and being able to feel, the opponent's mechs and your mechs and where they're at and what they need to do and how to react or how to keep your options open is a lot of it's going to come with experience. So, take everything with a grain of salt and just start playing the games and seeing how the movement phase works out for you. It's definitely one of the biggest, it is the key to victory is in the movement phase.
Yeah, definitely after your game, look back at the points that you saw as critical tipping points and realize who had the best movement at the time. Was there something that could have been done to maybe mitigate one way or the other?
All right, I think it's some time for some number talk.
Number talk.
So we've talked a lot about movement phase, but let's actually crunch some numbers and get statistical. So when you're in a mech and you're piloting, you're always going to be working off of a 4-up if you're shooting anything before you add in range. And that's just your normal gunnery skill before you factor in anything. So that's a 4-up normally. Once you start walking, that's a 5-up, and that takes your chance to hit before range from 92% to 83%. And that's what most people would still consider optimum modifiers. Once you get to a 8-up, and that's
8-up is a run with a normal gunnery skill at medium range, and you have a 42% chance of hitting.
Yeah, so that's normally when I call, okay, I'm not actually owning this engagement. That's not when I'm making shots that I expect to hit. So I'm not trying to bet my game on a 8-up normally. If I'm actually planning on doing damage, I want my total targeting and attacker modifier to be a 7-up, because that's going to be essentially 50-50.
Of course, if I can be hitting on 5s, that's great, especially if my opponent's going to be hitting on something greater than 5. But like I said, like I said earlier in the podcast, I like to keep things at 8 or less. Like you said, if you're trying to win a game on 9s, you're probably not going to win that game.
Yeah, because the 9-up is essentially a 1 in 4 chance to hit. That's you jumping before you factor in range.
The one exception to that situation that I find myself in is if I have a big risk-reward gun, and I have to jump to get that into short range, I will take a 9-up on that. And that's the only... I don't rely on 10-up, but I will jump a mech to get a AC-20 into short range on a 9-up. I mean, I guess we could assume that people know that, your opponent's going to be generating a mod too. Like that Victor, I find my Victor's shooting on 9s all the time. That's 4 + 3 + 1. I try to stay away from 10s and higher. If I can get a free shot and I'm not going to take any heat, sure. But if I'm going to be taking any heat or expecting any return fire, I don't like to go above 9. And I definitely like to keep it below 8.
Yeah, I almost always try to assume that my opponent's mechs are going to be generating at least a +2 mod, whether it be from terrain or from movement, to hit them. So, like I said, an 8 is normally where I consider the shots going to miss, and I try not to gamble my feelings and my victory on an 8-up. As we all know, the critical hits chance is an 8-up, and that doesn't come around as much as you would think. So speed is a big component of shooting and getting shot at. So making sure that you're moving and generating the most mod that you can, while also making that decision of whether you want to be more offensive or more defensive. That phase is key.
Yeah, you kind of want to be like the Doom Marine, always on the move.
I mean, a still mech is almost always a dead mech unless you have the longest range.
Yeah, if I don't have LRMs or AC2s on a mech, I'm not expecting it to stay stationary in some sort of a nest. And it needs a really good screen to screen out enemy mechs, even then. Movement phase. Keep your to-hit numbers low and your enemies to-hit numbers high, and you'll win the game.
Also roll 12s. Always roll 12s.
Always roll 12s.
All right, so today we learned how to master the movement phase, when to walk, when to run, when to jump, and when to stand still, but also when to dictate the engagement and take command of the mechs and the field. Dustin, Kurt, I'd like to thank y'all for coming on again.
Thanks for having me.
Same here. Always welcome.
We'll catch you next time on the Mechbay. If you have any questions, you can email us at the Mechbay Podcast at gmail.com or on Facebook at the Mechbay Podcast.